Welcome to a special video with the Beacon Center here today. I'm Ron Shultis. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Beacon Center, and I'm joined by Lee Sands, who's the Local Government Policy Analyst at the Libertas Institute, based out in Utah, but also our newest senior fellow, our senior fellow for local government, wanted to do an introduction and talk about a new report he recently released. Lee, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I mentioned you're one of our newest senior fellow here. You have an expertise in local government policy. I want to have you first talk about your background and how did you become interested in local government policy?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that I've come to be interested in it. And some of it just has to do with my general interest in politics as a child. I actually grew up in Florida, and so presidential politics were a huge thing, right? Every year Florida decided the election. And so,
Mhm.
um, presidential campaigns went across the state and I had opportunities to go there. And so, you turned on TV and it was talking about national elections and the federal government. And so I just soaked that up as a teenager. And then, I hit a point where I felt like I had learned what I could. I didn't really have much of a way to kind of impact what was going on at the federal government. I felt like I was just kind of consuming information. And so when I went out to college in Utah at Brigham Young University, I kind of got plugged into what was going on at the state level. And kind of a similar story there. There's only so much that you can really learn and impact at the state level. And once I felt like I had learned that, I kind of turned to the local government.
Mm.
And that was where, I say kind of my mind was expanded because I felt like all they did was probably, elect dog catchers or, fix the sewer when it broke, right? I had no idea that they had as much control over our everyday lives as we do. Just as a quick story, when I was recently graduated from college, I had some friends that we wanted to rent a house together. But it turned out that in the city that we lived in, you could only have three people that were unrelated living together. In other words, there were four of us that were buds that wanted to live
Yeah,
together, but we were restricted in doing that. And I thought, where does this restriction come from?
right.
And I kind of went down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and the list goes on and on and on about what local government a lot of times prevents you from being able to do with your property. And so, when you become a homeowner, it's a whole nother level of things that you can and can't do on your property. So that's kind of a that's kind of a quick rendition,
Okay.
if you will, of why I care and kind of my background.
I remember that a similar issue became a big deal in Nashville when there were, I think it was these Vandy or Belmont students were kicked out of their house because too many of them were unrelated and living under one roof, and the city like shut it down, and it made a big stir. And I think they actually changed it because of that, with how many universities we have in Nashville. But I think you bring up a really good point. You talked about how you started off like really focusing and caring about the national level. And then you kind of went down to the state level when you moved down to Utah. And then, particularly once you bought a home, and I can feel you on that as a relatively new homeowner, right? You realize how much actually, while all the news and attention, if you turn on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, whatever news outlet you prefer, you're going to see a lot about the federal government. But in my opinion, it doesn't really impact your day-to-day life as much as you kind of pointed out your local government. Am I wrong in that?
No, you're not wrong. I mean, I think it's very good to pay attention to what's going on at the national level and to vote and to make some impact kind of where you can, right? But there are so many issues that they're essentially just talking about, right? Like they're not really making much progress anyways. And so, but one thing that's interesting about local government, kind of by comparison, is you could pick up your cell phone, dial the number of your local city councilor, and they'll just pick up the phone and say hello.
Right. That's awesome.
They don't have staff that screens all the calls. And so, if you're having an issue that's affecting you, or that there's an issue that you care about, you have a much more direct line and much more direct capacity to affect change. And even in voting, your voting power is much higher
Mhm.
because the participation rate in local elections is typically lower than at state or federal elections.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I hear a lot in our kind of space, and you'll know what I mean by this. On the center right, we have this kind of tension you hear between the concept of local control or using other levels of government, whether it's the state or the federal, to implement change at the local level, typically around like um, private property protections or something else, um, can you talk a little bit about this dynamic and how should we approach this? Because when I hear, state elected officials, local elected officials, this is a dynamic, a tension that seems to play out on the center right a lot. Is this kind of like using the government to enact pro-freedom reforms, but also respecting local government's ability to be as sane or wild as they want to be? How should we approach this issue, in your opinion?
So I think at its foundation, the first thing to do is to kind of shift our mental model on the whole conversation a little bit. For example, at least in my mental model, I think of the federal government kind of sitting at the top, and I
Mm-hmm.
think it should do very little, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got the state government there, and there's a lot of power in the state governments because they created the federal government, and in turn, it was the state governments that created the local governments,
Right.
right? And so a lot of focus should be put on what the state is doing. They have a lot of power, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But then moving further down to the local government, right? They've been delegated certain authorities from the state government to do certain things. A lot of kind of a hot topic is in housing
Mm-hmm.
and land use. And so, but what I like to add to this formulation of federal versus state versus local is actual self-government.
Okay.
So there's an actual layer, kind of, I don't want to say below the government, right? But self-government is really the key, right? If there's a government that is forcing you to do something or to not be able to do something on your property, which level of government really isn't the key. The key question should be, should the individual be able to have the freedom to do that particular thing? And if there's one level of government that is using coercion and
Mhm.
is impeding freedom, let's say the local government is doing something, right? Like they're, sending you citations for having your grass 6 inches tall, right? But then the state government steps in and says, hey, 6 inches tall is not something that you should be able to send a citation for. The
Sure.
state government has helped you. The state government has elevated the individual up and has granted them freedom. So I think that's kind of a core piece of the
Mhm.
way I like to talk about this tension between local control, and kind of a phrase that I like to use is I'm very concerned with localer control, meaning again, the property owner as the owner and kind of the king of their property, and what are they able to do? That's where, in my opinion, the center right should be. Now, if we want to talk, further and deeper about exactly what should local be able to do versus state, I think you got to take it issue by issue.
Mhm.
And again, you have to look at it through that lens of freedom.
So almost like a question before you even decide almost which govern level of government is most appropriate, right? Like a kind of a first principle issue of that individual freedom. I like that. And also, I don't know if where I live can fine me for having my grass too long because I definitely don't do it enough. So now you got me scared. I need to check my local ordinances on that because I don't do a good enough job on staying top of my lawn. I'm waiting for my son to be old enough to take that off my plate. Uh, anyways, you mentioned housing, and this is something that Beacon has been talking increasingly more about, and how local governments particularly have an impact on housing. You recently released a report brief. I love the title, Make Zoning Make Sense. Um, Great title. Let's start with the big picture. What are some key takeaways or recommendations from the report? And even more broadly, why should we care about reforming zoning? Why does it matter? Why should people care?
So I'll start with your second question about why people should care about changing zoning. I was gobsmacked when I learned exactly what local governments do with zoning. I
Mm.
mean, for example, I wanted to put an ADU, that's an accessory dwelling unit, just kind of a little apartment next to my house. And I wasn't able to do that because it was going to be a few feet too close to the property line,
Okay.
right? My neighbor didn't care, was
Yep.
aware, but I wasn't able to do that. And so my grandmother wasn't able to live in the little apartment that I wanted to build for her. And so now she had, her own kind of housing crisis, so to speak, right?
Wow. That's kind of
And
like, did you ever grow up with siblings in the backseat of the car? Like, okay, here's the dividing line, your side of the row and my side of the row. Like, you can't come over, kind of like
oh
that.
yeah, oh yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
And so, just going on from there, it's not just accessory dwelling units that governments don't let people do. I mean, something as simple as, let's say there's a really old building that someone wants to tear down
Mm.
and build a duplex there. In probably 80% of most cities, you can't do that.
Wow.
Another example would be, let's say you have kind of a larger lot with a house on it. Let's say you wanted to divide that lot and put another house on it and sell that off and make some money. You couldn't do that either.
Right.
And so to me, once I saw all of these restrictions, I began to realize, well, of course we have a housing shortage because all of these rules and regulations prevent people from building homes. So,
Yeah.
you start talking about supply and demand, and it was obvious to me that local governments, with the zoning power that they have, are kind of messing with the free market that kind of should be there in housing. And so we're all experiencing it across the country now, this skyrocketing of housing prices. So
And
that's
this
the answer to the to your second question.
and this gets really complex too, right? The lengths of those regulations. I remember when Beacon was doing our Middle Tennessee zoning atlas, just for Nashville and its surrounding counties, it was like over 8,000 pages of zoning regulations to go through all the different zoning regs for all the different cities that we initially covered. We had no idea of the scope of what we were taking on. So not, I mean, and I would certainly want to get to your reform or recommendations and everything, but I mean, you're not wrong when you talk about like there's almost an endless amount to learn about these things, right? I mean, it's not just like they touch one or two things. I mean, it gets down to like the slope of your roof and everything too, can it?
Yeah, I mean, if you read 3 or 4 pages of a zoning code, it will put an HOA contract to shame, right? So all the things that we think of as, oh, when you live in an HOA, you've got all these rules and regulations, and when I
Yeah.
don't live in an HOA, I have more freedom. Maybe you have more freedom because ultimately, like you mentioned, hundreds and hundreds of pages. And that's what I talk about in my most recent brief is that we don't have to do zoning the way that we're doing it now. It doesn't have to be as complicated as it is.
Okay.
It could be vastly simplified and vastly improved. There are arguments for reforming zoning to allow for different types of buildings to get constructed throughout the town. Those would be good from my perspective, especially as we're trying to alleviate a housing crisis. But just in terms of the sheer level of complexity, we're in need of a rewrite in most of our cities in the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned, and this was one of the areas I thought was really interesting, and I was hoping you could dive a little bit deeper into this. You talk about how our zoning codes need a rewrite in many cases, but we kind of fix them piecemeal by creating smaller zones, rezones, plan developments. We maybe try and use form-based codes. Why is this not solving the problem? Can you talk more about
So I like the example of form-based codes because when I first learned about it, I thought, oh, that's very interesting. Like, if you could just have a zoning code that told people how their homes have to look, I don't personally like that, from the government. But if that was all you told me was that my house had to be a certain shape and that I could, have a corner store or a barber shop inside, I would be stoked. And so I was glad to hear about form-based codes. But then when I researched further and saw really what they ended up doing was just layering
it?
form-based codes on top of an already convoluted code, and essentially it just put diagrams inside of the zoning code.
Wow.
And so it didn't really achieve the freedom that some of the reformers were hoping that it would get. And that's not all of their fault. A lot of it had to do with the way that it was implemented in a particular city. But usually, what they do is they take downtown and they want to make it look a certain way, and so they do a form-based code that applies to downtown. And now all the buildings have this certain facade,
Okay.
and there's pictures of that facade inside the zoning code. But yet we still have all the cruft that exists throughout the rest of the code.
So what are, let's say, one to two, maybe three good reforms if I was a city council member looking to reform my city's zoning, what would be some things you would point them towards? Is it just simplifying, just outright allowing new types of housing? What kind of combination would you recommend they look at?
So it obviously depends on how aggressive you want to be towards addressing the housing issue. But in terms of just kind of fixing the zoning, just reduce the number of zones that you have in your city. For
Mm,
example, when I looked at cities, and I'm sure Tennessee's cities are the same way, um, the longer the city had been around, they had 30, 40,
yeah,
sometimes 50 different zones. And so in this zone, maybe in this zone you could have a backyard cottage for your grandmother, but in this zone over here you couldn't. And they just had it so have it so convoluted that the property rights that they're kind of taking and granting
right.
are so confused that no one really knows what they are. And so just reducing it down instead of having 20 zones, maybe have 6 to maybe 12 zones. And
Okay.
then have those zones name something that makes sense to people. The average Joe who just wants to, pick it up and learn what he can do with his property. And so, but also when you collapse the number of zones, you're also reducing the number of regulations overall,
That's a good
right?
point.
And so what you can do when you reduce the number of zones is also enable those zones that you've kind of rewritten into existence, have it be where they can have accessory dwelling units that are above the garage or in the backyard. I think that's a very powerful one because people already own their property and they've already paid for the land. And
Right.
so it's just going to be the cost of construction. That's going to help a lot of that's
Mhm.
going to help there be a lot of affordable housing without the taxpayer subsidy, right? People are willing to build their own little apartments in their backyard, and the government won't have to subsidize it. So that's a great one. Probably the last one that I'll mention is just allowing people to have smaller lots. So earlier I mentioned people's ability to divide their lots in
Yep.
half or divide it into thirds. If you grant people the ability to have smaller lots to build smaller homes on, you're also going to reduce the cost of the homes that get built there because the cost of the land will be distributed across the new parcels that are created, right? And
Yep.
so, that kind of elusive starter home that we think back to that existed back in the 50s, we can do them again, but there's actually some regulations that we need to get rid of.
I love the point about just having fewer regulate or fewer zoning districts. It basically ensures that people don't have different levels of property rights just depending upon what area of town they moved into, right? Like what they can and cannot do. And let's be honest, when most people go through the process of buying a home, they're not wondering what the zoning laws are for that area and what it would allow them to do, whether it's like add an extension on the back or build that ADU you talked about for grandma or a young, married couple in the backyard or something like that, right? And so, just the fact of like, oh, I live in R2 and right across the street is R4, and I could have a totally different set of rights, supposedly, than that other house right across the street because it's an R4. It's pretty wild. And so I think that's a really good point. And just making sure that you know people are more treated the same and they can do the similar things regardless of a arbitrary line drawn on a map. So that's awesome. So let's kind of wrap up here. What would the ideal, and you kind of touched on this, how would our cities look if we reformed all of our zoning codes? What would it look like? How would it impact our daily life? I know that's a little philosophical, but I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts.
No, I think if we had more freedom to build what we wanted to, it would look how we wanted it to look, right? How, your house would look like the way you wanted it to, and the
Oh,
number of, the number of homes and the way that it was painted and so forth would look the way that you wanted it to, and the same would be for me. And
mm,
so, whenever you go, kind of downtown, if you reform some of the zoning, you would see more smaller businesses.
hmm.
There's one thing that I found is that when zoning codes are too complicated, the small business person is kind of edged out of the way because they just can't understand what's really going on. And
Yeah.
so the larger corporations that have the lawyers and the means to go through and learn what they need to do, that's what you get and that's what you see. And
Okay.
so, I could go on for a while what things would, physically look like, but frankly, you could make some pretty radical reforms and it wouldn't look all that much different,
Mm,
right? I mean, people build homes, there's trends in the way homes look are the way they look, right?
right.
But you would have more of a mix, right? You'd have some smaller homes, mid-sized homes, larger homes. Um, and you would probably have some more home-based businesses kind of sprinkled throughout the neighborhood. You wouldn't have to get in your car and drive all the way across town to go to the salon or to the
Yep.
barber. You could just walk a few blocks. And so I think those are probably the most noticeable differences that you would see if if I was king for a day and could kind of help cities rezone the way that I think they should. But ultimately, it's not about the way I think things should be done or the way that Ron Schultes thinks the way they should be done. It's more about the person who actually owning the property, how they think it should be done.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think about my family, or my extended family is from Wisconsin mostly, and a lot of several of them from Milwaukee. And I just think about, like, in Milwaukee, there's those corner bars and grocery stores that you just are missing a lot of cities today, right? And so I think partly they must allow those. It's been grandfathered in, and we've kind of lost that sense, that walkability, like you kind of mentioned. And I think it would be really cool to see that come back and design, basically, like as you kind of pointed out, the market would determine what we want, and that's what would get built if the laws got out of the way. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you, Lee. I will be sure to link your report in the post for this. If you want to check it out, please do so. It's great and really kind of clears through the fog of trying to understand what this is, how it impacts us, and some good reforms for both, that can be done at the city level or kind of through the state level or wherever, right? And so it's a great report. Lee, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate the conversation and telling us a little bit about your newest publication, and look forward to more interviews and talking to you about the stuff you're working on.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome.